So everyone, I'm going to give you a moment to reflect on this chart for a moment. And when I say reflect, I mean identifying any distinguishing features that you see. And I would like you to particularly look at it from anything that you've learned by yourself or from me about spiritual combinations in a person's chart, factors that can incline a person towards a spiritual life. Of course, our topic today is related to my article, Jai Guru Dev, which was on periods, sub-periods, both from the Vimshotri, more from the Vimshotri than otherwise, but also from the Jaimini point of view as to when spiritual gurus come into a person's life. So just have a look at this for the moment. And if anyone wants to say anything about something they see as being a rather distinctive feature of this chart, particularly from the standpoint of spirituality, feel free to speak up. Also be thinking about when a guru, spiritual guru, may have come into this person's life. I'm showing the Vimshotri Dasha just with the major periods. I will also show sub-periods at some point. Who'd like to say something first? Get us started.
Jupiter Ketu.
Sorry?
Jupiter Ketu are conjunct.
So say something more about that, Roberto.
Usually significators of spiritual aspirations are usually, it's a good thing for them to be conjunct, I think.
Right. So Ketu is referred to in Jyotish as the Moksha Karaka, right? And Jupiter is the Jnana Karaka, indicator of higher knowledge and wisdom. And you've heard me speak about or write about the fact that in order for Ketu to actually create inclinations towards spiritual life, normally you have to see it getting spiritualized in some way. One of the ways in which Ketu gets spiritualized is when it's under the strong influence of Jupiter, which is what we see in this case. So yes, this can be a combination, won't always be so, but can be a combination that inclines a person towards spiritual life, and that it's certainly true of this individual. So again, any distinctive features of the chart, particularly as it relates to astrology and spirituality?
Exalted moon in the 12th house, aspected by Jupiter.
This sounds like Giresh.
Yes, hi Mark.
Hello. So could you just say something or elaborate more upon that? What strikes you about that?
Sure. So 12th house is considered the house of spirituality. And if you have an exalted benefic there, it is it favors spirituality more. And again, it has a favorable aspect from a benefic, Jupiter, as well.
So the moksha houses, we know, are 4, 8, and 12, right? And in particularly the 12th. So having a, in some way, prominent or favorable 12th house can be good for spiritual inclinations, experiences in ashrams, retreat, that sort of thing. And here we see a benefic here. Well, the moon is rather dark still, but still it's in its exaltation sign aspected by Jupiter. So yes, I will go along with that. What else?
So it looks like we have the 5th Lord and the 9th Lord together in the 11th house, and both of them being strong because they're Vargodama. And well, why would are you talking about that as a distinguishing feature of the chart, or in some other way, Chuck? A distinguishing feature. The Lord of the house of the teacher, the guru, and the Lord of the house of mantra together, and both of them strong. It seems like it would give the chart a little bit of a spiritual meaning.
Okay, very good. Now, you're all going to see an article from me, the October article, that talks about this peculiar condition of a planet where it's both in its debilitation sign, but it's also Vargotama, which is what we see in the case of our ninth lord Saturn here. And then also, you mentioned it's a combination of 5 and 9. Both of them have, in the spiritual context, important meaning that way. You know, in terms of a house of spirituality, which house in particular would be, you know, overtly the house of spirituality? Anyone?
Ninth.
Ninth house.
Going to be the ninth.
Lord in ninth house.
So I heard Vijay say we've got the Lagna Lord in ninth. Yes, you know, this is probably, you know, the most apparent and obvious feature that could suggest that the person is oriented towards spirituality and spiritual life. So now look at the Dasha sequence, particularly in the light of what I believe Chuck just said, and what would be your best guess as to when a spiritual teachers came into this person's life?
Jupiter.
Elaborate.
Well, Jupiter is significator for Guru, and from Dasha Lagna Jupiter, we've got the exalted moon in the ninth house.
Okay, and you know, it would be a very reasonable deduction. Didn't happen to be how that came out, but you know, in terms of you know, thinking about potentially eligible peerages, that certainly becomes one for the reasons that you explained. Anyone else want to venture an idea that way?
Jupiter Ketu.
Jupiter Ketu for the same reasons. But again, it wasn't, you know, I'm just going to give you the clue. It's happened a little later in life.
Rahu, Jupiter.
So we're focusing in on Jupiter. And of course, Jupiter is the natural significator of these things, as my article brought out. It certainly can bring this. Is there a particular Dasha period that, you know, gets particularly highlighted this way?
It could be, as you said, it is later in life. It could be Saturn period, because Saturn is the ninth word, and ninth house is the house of a guru. So it could be Saturn. And Saturn with Venus is the fifth lord, another house that can show mantras and some spiritual practices. So it could be Saturn or... Mm-hmm.
And that's absolutely right, Katrina. In fact, it's happened relatively recently, and bringing up some period. People look down at the Vimshottari Dasha. This very important, you know, teacher who she is. She believes she's really met her life's guru, and that's happened in Saturn Venus, as one might expect. And you know, the influence of Venus here as the fifth lord. You mentioned the idea, of course, it's, you know, its fifth house has to do with spiritual practice, particularly, you know, I talked about it related to mantra diksha, you know, initiation by the guru with a mantra, which I believe did happen during this time here. But what the fact that the fifth lord's involved here, what else could that mean and bring out and suggest about, you know, this period and combining together? Folks, I want to mention that there's kind of the sound of dishes in the background being clinked together for someone. And if that's in your environment, I would ask you to mute your microphone unless that time when you're speaking.
You could also bring out the concept of Poorva Punya, the things that this individual may have done in past lives that are of spiritual nature that would be showing up, and then bring together her and a guru at this time.
Absolutely, Chuck. You know, perfect answer in my view. You know, we've highlighted in articles related to spirituality how, you know, some of the special meaning of the fifth house, fifth lord has to do with Poorva Punya, which is, you know, previous life merit in general, but sort of a subset of that is efforts a soul has been making towards spiritual development, that when a person's running the dasha of the fifth house, planets in the fifth house, or planets connected to the fifth lord, as her Saturn is here, teachers, teachings can come back in your life, that you were connected to in the previous lifetime, that has to do with the spiritual path that you were on, which, the Saturn Venus period and the Saturn major period in general really suggests. Now, what comes after Saturn?
Saturn, Mercury.
Saturn, Mercury. So this is good. The trend is going to continue strongly, is it not?
Yeah, Mercury in the ninth.
But going back to the Saturn-Venus conjunction here, Venus rules the fifth house, but also rules another house. What could that suggest? And everything that Garesh was saying previously about the 12th house here. What could also... Someone said, go ahead. Somebody was going to say something?
Yeah, hi Mark. I was saying it might indicate being in an ashram or a retreat.
Absolutely. And, I remember K and Rao, my Jyotish guru, talking about how, the 12th house represents the fourth house from the teacher, right? Fourth house from the guru, because the 12th house is the fourth house from the ninth, and therefore it represents the guru's ashram. And, she has spent, since meeting her teacher, she has made regular visits and trips to India to spend time in the ashram of her guru. So Venus, also connected to Saturn as a 12th lord, is bringing that result as well. So, we talk about this Saturn period, right? And it has a great interest to me because of this idea of a Vargotama debilitated planet. What would people say about that? What are people's thoughts about that, maybe based on some of your own experience you've had in looking at such planets? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Does it mean it's doubly debilitated and therefore worse, weakened in two ways, or?
No, what I recall you saying is that...
Go ahead, Chuck.
Oh, I was just saying that what I recall you saying is that what it is, Vargotama, it actually does make the planet stronger. It's not doubly debilitated, so it is going to give Saturn some strength.
That's been more my experience, and you'll see that my next article is all about such planets. Okay. Now, from going away from the idea of the spirituality, what else is this a combination of, or what kind of yoga does this combination give?
It's a Dhana Yoga, Saturn, Venus.
Talk about that, Vijay. What are you seeing here?
Yeah. So 5th and 9th Lord in 11th.
Right, 5th and 9th Lord in the 11th, it's the structure of a Dhan Yoga, right?
Mm-hmm.
To what degree it would actually give Dhan Yoga is, a question mark, given, Saturn's sort of unusual and idiomatic condition. I guess I just had a thought that I forgot to mention before. What would be another indication that she'd be spending time in ashrams and spiritual retreats in her Saturn-Venus period besides what we just talked about? Does anybody see any other, strong indication as to why that might be the case? See that Saturn and Venus fall in the 12th house from a strong Chandralagna as well.
Oh, sure.
And then, again, sort of confirmation of how this Saturn period could bring teachers into our life, just seeing that it's, also the 9th Lord from the moon as well. So, one thing you've seen me do over and over again is we also have to check these combinations and what kind of results what kind of combinations they are from Chandralagna, particularly when, Chandralagna has some source of strength in moon being in Cancer or Taurus, as it is here. Okay. So let me bring up another chart here. One moment. But, before I leave this, and this is the kind of a good test of, the kind of results such a planet as Saturn is in. I would share with you that her financial circumstances are actually not that good at the moment. Whether they'll become so, particularly in something like, Saturn Venus is something that remains to be seen. But more about that when you get my article that's coming out. Okay, so I'm bringing up another chart here.
Hi, Mark. While you bring up the chart, I just want to mention another thing.
Sure.
Here I see like Saturn, Venus are in a Graha Yuddha. With probably what I feel is Saturn is winning. So I think it's more of the Saturn results that she's getting.
Well, it's again, it adds a additional twist to this combination. The idea that, everybody understands the idea of planetary war, where the planets are less than a degree apart. There's some controversy about who wins the war. I shall soon actually be publishing another article about my thoughts and researches about planetary war. But it raises a question as to what degree the done yoga here, right? How strong a result or how good a result, what the magnitude of the result will be. Okay, but so it's a good comment. I neglected to mention that. Okay, so I've just put on. Everyone's seeing, Alberto, everybody's seeing another chart now. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So take a moment to reflect on this one, and again, I'm going to reduce the Vimshotri Dasha sequence to just, when the major periods happen for the moment, right? And just take a moment. Again, the distinguishing features of the chart is something that I'm wanting to make note of, but then also, looking at the chart again from the standpoint of the astrology of spirituality. What strikes you? What stands out to you?
Well, what starts for me is the 5th Lord, the 9th Lord, and the 12th Lord are all together in the 12th house. Jupiter,
Yes.
Venus.
Yes. That's 9th Lord, 5th Lord, and who else did you say? Jupiter?
12th Lord, yes, Jupiter, the 12th Lord.
12th Lord, Jupiter, all together in the 12th house. What do we see about Jupiter here? What's special about it?
Yeah.
It's in its own sign.
And it's in its own sign. Anything else?
And it's Vargotum as well.
It's Vargotum as well. And what about the 9th Lord?
Same thing with Mercury, Vargotum as well.
Right. So quite a collection of, certain house lords, and then, natural benefics, and then also the 12th Lord in its own 12th house, Vargotama. So quite a 12th house.
So as just a little bit of a tangent, not to throw us too far off, but this is a pretty good Voshi yoga here as well. Does that help a lot in this regard?
Very good, Chuck. He's mentioning, what could you explain Voshi yoga?
Well, we're talking about planets in the 12th from the sun, and here it's Shubha, mostly Shubha Voshi yoga. Rahu's there, of course, but you've got a couple of very strong planets there, and all the natural benefics are there in the 2nd from the sun.
And what have we been learning about, therefore, the effect on these planets?
What we're learning is that the sun adds sort of a brilliance then to the effects these planets are going to have.
Exactly right. So, I've those in my Graha Yoga video subscription program, we've been talking about solar and lunar yogas from the standpoint of being foundational yogas to a birth chart that can add strength to them, but then also the way in which planets involved in solar and lunar yogas can get qualified, favorably qualified by being in such yogas, and with the sun, because these planets are near enough to the sun that they're getting the beautiful reflection, but not that close such that they're having any sort of combustion quality. It adds power and luster to them, and they can give their results even more strongly. And any yogas that they might be involved in are also favorably qualified and enhanced. So all of that's happening. And here, Chuck mentioned it's a pure, or not quite pure, but it's a full Shubha Vosha Yoga, because all the natural benefics are falling in the 12th here. There is the influence of the Rahu Ketu axis, so it's not entirely pure. But then, ironically, what's going on both sides of them?
It's a malefic hemming.
It's some level of malefic hemming. Of course, the sun here is a mild malefic. So there's it's a very interesting kind of combination to consider. And I will share with you that this man has been from a very young age very committed to the spiritual pathway, very committed to seeking the goal of spiritual liberation, of moksha, of which, of course, the 12th house is the strongest moksha house, does, daily intensive yoga sadhana, teaches yoga sadhana. And, so this has been, a real major, big factor, theme in his life, as, what one might suspect, and especially given think about the Dasha sequence here. Born in the Saturn Mahadasha, right? But enters Mercury at age 12.
So what strikes me about this too, Mark, is that, you're talking about how strong this is in his life. So these planets also give a Chandra Adi Yoga too. And I wonder the influence of that on how focused he is on that.
Chuck, it sounds like you've been learning your solar and lunar yogas.
I'm a good teacher.
So, really, very good. So, could you kind of explain what you're talking about here?
Sure. So Venus, Jupiter, and Mercury in the 6th, 7th, and 8th from the moon, and they can either be spread out between those three signs or be grouped in any pattern between them. The strongest is when I spread out in the three signs. And so they have an effect on an individual of making them kind of give them a very strong focus in their life about whatever they want to do, making them kind of first in that area. And so when you talked about how strongly he's focused on that, I just kind of wondered that if that yoga was having an effect on that for him.
No, you're absolutely right, and I'm very gratified that you're understanding and noticing this. So the best Chandradi Yoga, or we might say the true type, is, as Chuck mentioned, where the natural benefics are evenly distributed between houses 6, 7, and 8 from the moon, which is not the case here. So this would be a variation, but it still could be considered maybe what I would call a quasi Chandradi Yoga, and what's from the standpoint of the moon, what's particularly good about this one, Chuck? Really good.
It's in its own house. And it's as bright as it's going to be. Well, pretty close anyway.
Right. So, the moon's always bright in Chandradi Yoga, almost by definition, as I explained. But, the brighter it is and the more and stronger the moon is, the more that's going to be the case. And this is what we see here. Moon in an angle in its own sign and just, 3 degrees past fullness. But again, the effect on the planets in the 12th house, because now we see that it's involved in both a solar yoga and a lunar yoga, is that it enhances and emphasizes these things even more. So this is really quite an interesting chart to consider from the standpoint of the combination of these planets in the 12th house. So you see the Dasha sequence. Ran, went into, born was just, anyway, he entered Mercury at age 12, ran that from age 12 to 29. What might you surmise from that Mercury period, and particularly certain subperiods? Given my theme here.
Mercury Ketu, Mercury Jupiter, Mercury Venus would be highly spiritual because all the 3 benefics are aspecting Ketu in the 6th house.
Right. So good, Gresh. Well, first of all, we see Ketu in the sign of a benefic, Mercury in this case, and coming under the influence of all the benefics, right? And notice that it goes in the 12th house from a strong Chandra Lagna, right? In birth Lagna, from the birth Lagna, it's from the 6th house, but from a strong Chandra Lagna, it goes to the 12th, receiving all the influence of those natural benefics, including its own 12th lord, but particularly a Vargotama Swakshetra Jupiter. So again, this is some of those conditions in which Ketu gets highly spiritualized. But in terms of a guru coming into his life, what were the periods that you identified, Garesh? Say again.
It's Mercury Ketu, Mercury Jupiter, and Mercury Venus.
Right, and interestingly enough, the information I have from this individual is that, let me pull out the sub-periods within Mercury. The information I have from him is that in 1993, a guru came into his life, which, as you can see, is either going to be Mercury Moon or Mercury Mars, right? But then he gave me the information that from 1996 to 99, a number of very important teachers came into his life. And you can see that equates to Mercury Rahu and Mercury Jupiter, just as one might expect, right? But again, just as we saw in the previous chart where the 9th lord was conjunct a planet, what do we see here? A particular planet that has significance this way. Do you remember the pattern we saw in the previous chart where the 9th lord is with a particular house lord?
Yeah, here we have Venus and Mercury together in the 12th, 5th lord and 9th lord.
5th lord again, right? The fifth lord again. So how the Mercury major period activates a lot of different things, but being with the 5th lord, it actually activates Poorva Punya as well. So it's the kind of the typical sort of thing you see about the idea of what Krishna was telling Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita about. When Krishna Arjuna asked the question about what happens to the soul if they don't complete the goal of yogas in one lifetime, and of course, Krishna tells them no effort is ever lost. In the next lifetime they'll be born into circumstances where at some point they'll sort of get back on the pathway, or they'll, the Poorva Punya will manifest, and these things will come back in their life, and they'll sort of, as it were, pick up in terms of their spiritual development where they left off. And, this is certainly, I think, an example of that, in which how the Mercury period then brings that, but then, see the period that the person is running now.
Venus Rahu. Yeah.
Well, first of all, ran Ketu, right? Look at the Dasha sequence here and think about this as far as a sustained, he runs Mercury, and all this comes back into his life. Then he runs Ketu, giving the result of Mercury and all those planets in the 12th. And then now, he's running his Venus major period, happens to be in Venus Rahu now. So it's, you'll see sometimes people will get into a spiritual pathway and then they'll start running a different dasha and things go in a different direction. But you see the way in which the dasha sequence favors him in towards a very sustained interest in spirituality, a very sustained interest in, doing spiritual practices and trying to develop spiritually, which is, very much been what this person's life has all been about. If I'm not mistaken, I think this person gets up every day in Brahma Muhurta, a couple hours before sunrise, and, just does his intensive yoga practices, teaches these, as I mentioned before, too. So it's quite an interesting chart to consider from this standpoint. Any other comments or questions before we move on here?
Mark, I would like to say that we see one of the 3 spirituality yogas that you have given us. I think it's Shriant yoga, formed by Sun, Moon, and the Lord of the Lagna, Saturn, being in Kendras or trines. In this case, we see Sun and Moon in Kendras and Saturn as the Lagnavort in the 5th house. So this adds to the, that this person can be oriented in seeking spirituality and high knowledge. It is related to Shiva, right? Shrikanta Yoga. Mm-hmm.
Well, as usual, Ekaterina, you always remember what you learned. And so, I congratulate you. Yes, I was wondering if someone was going to mention this. We've got Shrikanta Yoga here. These are the 3 yogas I gave in that article, The Soul Quality of Saints. They come from Paladipika. And what you have to keep in mind about these is that, planets have to have some sort of strength here for them to manifest fully like any yoga, but also, they're much more likely to actually incline a person towards spirituality if there are other factors, other strongly supportive factors that suggest spiritual inclinations. You will find these yogas in the charts of people that aren't necessarily, spiritually oriented. But in a context like this, that's certainly part of their meaning. Again, the definition is you have to have the sun, the moon, and the Lagna Lord all in angles or trions, which is what we see here. But then, think about the dispositors here. The sun's dispositor is Saturn, which goes to the 5th, and then Saturn's dispositor is back to Venus with all that combination in the 12th. So these are, again, a way you can sort of gauge whether these yogas are really, inclining a person more towards spiritual life. And of course, after Venus, what is he running?
Sun.
Sun. And after the sun?
Moon.
Right. And, by the way, something else I mentioned that, this man is not a sannyasi. He's a householder. He's married. Doesn't have any children. But the Moon-Saturn contact, Saturn's the Saturn's influence on the Moon, very often, again, in the context of a spiritually oriented chart, will give a person what I would call sannyasi type tendencies, or at least some level of in yoga it's known as vairagya, or dispassion, right, or detachment. It can help, create those sort of qualities, which are, considered good, obviously, from the spiritual standpoint. Very good, Ekaterina. Thank you. And what else? Anything else before we leave this one?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. I would like to say a couple of things. So, 4 or more planets anywhere like in a house, that also would constitute Vairagya Yoga. Here it is in the 12th house. Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Rahu.
Right. What Garesh is referring to is in the chapter on Pravaraj or Sannyasa yogas in the Brahmahora. It talks about 4 or more grahas, and there's some question whether those 4 or more grahas can include Rahu or Ketu or not. But here we do see 4 grahas. In order for that to usually be actually the case, the 10th Lord has to be involved and not be combust. Again, this person is not a sannyasi. One of the things it says about this combination in particular is that could produce a sannyasi, or it could produce someone who respects and reveres that kind of person and that kind of ideal, which again is certainly true in this person's case. So again, it's a very good and relevant comment. Thank you, Garesh.
From the Moon, the 5th Lord in its own house.
From the Moon, yes. Saturn, Mars here becomes the 5th Lord in the 5th house. Right. Chuck, were you going to say something?
I was just going to ask, the effects that you mentioned of that Saturn was having on the Moon in this chart, have you noticed that in charts that weren't necessarily spiritual charts, that people were having effects in their lives like that, and they were causing them, some questioning, some difficulty, things like that, and you saw it and had some concept about what was going on? Like, let's say somebody who wasn't really finding relationships easy in their life, and Saturn was having an effect.
Well, there's another way of looking at this. It's an affliction right to the Moon.
Sure, right, yes.
And in this case, because the Moon is the 7th Lord in the 7th house, it could, have some, in Mars is, aspecting Saturn here. So yes, what I've tried to emphasize is that, you can look at a certain combination from different angles.
Right.
And the way in which I kind of pose that question in my own mind when I'm assessing those things is sort of, okay, what is the best that this can mean? What is the worst that this could mean as far as, experiences in the person's life, right? The moon represents the manas, right? And, the idea of the sannyasa yogas that are given where, in the Navamsha, you've got the moon in the sign of Mars aspected by Saturn, or in the sign of Saturn aspected by Mars. This is really part of this idea is that, it's out of a sense of the suffering of life that a person goes looking for a way out of suffering. Which usually then, gets a person directed towards, spiritual life. And it's the overcoming of the egoic, point of view. These are all really good observations and comments, though. Thank you. Anything else?
Saturn also aspects the moon in the Navamsa.
Yes, there's a repetition of that moon-Saturn connection in the Navamsha, which, actually the yogas involving sannyasa yogas are stipulated in the line. Moon's not in the sign of Mars, aspected by Saturn. And again, this person is not a sannyasi, but he's got some internal sannyasi, vairagya, yogic detachment type inclinations, which is, why I highlighted this. Okay, we will go on now. And I want to bring up another chart. Oops, that didn't work. Okay, see another chart here, right? So now, do you see any combinations in this person's chart that, or periods that if you ran them, they might bring some spiritual inclinations and potentially a guru? I'll give you the Dasha sequence here. So you see that they were born, and then they were in Rahu, starting just very shortly after birth. I'm sorry, not shortly after birth, but early in life. Anyway, you see the Dasha sequence here. What ages the person ran these Dashas. What strikes you? What strikes you about the chart in general, about anything related to the astrology and spirituality?
Lagna Lord in the 12th house aspected by Saturn.
Lagna Lord in the 12th house aspected by Saturn. Well, that's exactly one of the reasons I'm showing this chart. And again, what does that suggest to you, Jyotish?
Yeah, it suggests like a spiritual person. Ketu also is in the 9th house in the sign of Jupiter. Saturn is in the sign of Jupiter, and Jupiter is in the 5th house. So all of this points to a spiritual person.
Right. Now, focusing on Ketu in particular, folks, we were talking about different conditions under which Ketu actually becomes a moksha karaka, right? And, here it goes into Pisces. That is the sign most associated with moksha. Secondly, it falls in the 9th house, overtly the house of spirituality. And then thirdly, it receives the aspect of Jupiter, who in this case happens to be the 9th lord itself, right? So this is, This is a, highly spiritualized Ketu, okay? But then, again, what would you think about this idea of, talk about Jupiter a little bit, Gresh, since you sort of brought this up. I mean, what makes you about it? Hello?
Jupiter aspects the ascendant as well.
Right. Well, Jupiter aspects on the ascendant well, but I guess, it's the ninth lord in the fifth house, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's the ninth lord in the fifth house. And look at its degrees. Do those degrees strike you? Does those degrees to strike anyone as significant from the standpoint of the astrology of spirituality?
Sarpadrekana.
Exactly. Good. I'm glad people recognize that. And again, Dasha sequence in terms of activating things.
Jupiter looks like a good beginning point.
Yes. I was hoping somebody would notice that. So you can see here that she moved into her Jupiter Mahadasha when she was just 18 years old, right? And then see the sequence here. Jupiter, Saturn, right?
And then, of course, Jupiter Ketu might be the place where she ran into the guru.
Well, that's a good surmise. And, I'm a little fuzzy about the exact timing here, but fairly early on in her Jupiter Mahadasha, she got, it was just like this major spiritual awakening that, again, you'd want to see that as being partly a reflection of just Poorva Punya with, Jupiter here falling in the fifth house. And she got involved with the Siddha Yoga organization. Siddha Yoga was, the offspring of Swami Muktananda. And then, his main disciple who became the main guru afterwards, referred to as Guru Mai. And she actually, it was Garesh who was noting how the Lagna Lord here goes to the 12th, aspected by Saturn. Basically, most of her, a good portion of her Jupiter Mahadasha, certainly the first half of it and so forth, she was basically living in ashramic circumstances, living in an ashram, essentially being a sannyasi. And although she's no longer in the ashram, she is essentially has been mostly living a sannyasi type lifestyle throughout most of her life. Very interesting woman. She's done she wrote a book called Spirituality for Dummies. She knows lots of stotras and chants stotras. She has done an English translation of the Bhagavad Gita that is then she sings, and she sells this on CD tapes. Her whole life, really, since the advent of the Jupiter Mahadasha, has just been all about spirituality, all about getting oriented towards spiritual life and seeking moksha, and being very much a renunciate in many ways. So if people want to just make any other comments of the chart, do you see anything else that might be relevant?
Shubhakarkari Yoga.
Okay, talk about that.
The ascendant is hemmed by two benefics here. Moon, though is waning, is reasonably bright, and Venus on the other side. So
there's some quality of that. The moon, how good of a moon, the moon produces such things. It just depends. As you said, it's waning, but more than half bright. So it still does have some brightness here. Jupiter's aspecting on the Lagna as well. Okay.
I was going to say Saraswati-like yoga.
Okay, go ahead and say more about that.
Well, Venus is in the second house. Mercury, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter all have to be in Kendras or Trichonas, and Jupiter is supposed to have some sort of strength. It doesn't have a strength, but there is an exchange between Venus and the Sun, which definitely strengthens both, Venus, and then therefore, because of the exchange, Mercury as well. So they're quite strong, and so that's why I was saying Saraswati-like.
Tracy, is this Tracy?
Yeah, yes, it is.
I'm clapping, Tracy. Very good. I was hoping people, you have to know this. You'd have to know this woman. It's not the best Saraswati yoga, as you mentioned here, because what is Jupiter's dignity? Can anybody just tell?
He's in a great friend sign, so that would make him fairly strong, right?
Right. So it's not the best Saraswati yogas have a really strong Jupiter, but this Jupiter is very well placed, right? And it is in the sign of a great friend. As Tracy was mentioning, there are sources of strength for both the other two, and again, I was trying to explain that this person is very artistically inclined, very musically inclined. Their whole life is about Vedic knowledge and Vedic wisdom. They play instruments, they chant beautifully, have memorized major stotras that they do, and so the Saraswati yoga has been very, very evident in the person's life. Starting in the Jupiter period, of course, now if you look, you can see that they're in the Mercury Mahadasha, right? And they've written books, a number of them. Yes, Saraswati Yoga is a significant, distinctive feature, of this birth chart. It's got some issues with it, but nonetheless, it is Saraswati Yoga.
And then adding to that is the solar yoga, the Shubhaveshi yoga, with Jupiter second from the Sun.
Right, and again, the effect being on that. Remember that this all sort of unfolded in her Jupiter Mahadasha, right? And what Chuck's referring to is, again, because Jupiter here is falling second from the Sun, giving this Veshi yoga. Any other yogas or any other results that Jupiter gives are going to be enhanced. One thing, that I didn't mention is that when she left the ashram, and she was living in an ashram in upstate New York, and she ended up going to Los Angeles, what she developed in the ashram is she became a very expert videographer and video editor, and would produce all the videos for the organization. Again, you see the artistic expression of the Saraswati Yoga. And Jupiter here is involved. It gives the results of good yoga. To make a long story short, she ended up going to LA, and towards the end of her Jupiter period, she became a Emmy award-winning videographer during this time. So just sort of a different manifestation of some of the more mundane considerations related to some of the results that the Jupiter Mahadasha could give.
And Jupiter's in the house of creativity as well.
House of creativity, yeah, absolutely. And so, very good notation there, seeing the Saraswati Yoga here. Is there any other comments that people would like to note about this chart before we move on? Okay. Now, in the charts we've seen thus far, we've seen the operation of the ninth lord, or the ninth house in some way, bringing, spiritual teachings and teachers into a person's life. But as I was pointing out in the article, it can happen in different ways. And so I want to show you this chart here, which, as you'll see, has some similarities to, have some features that are common to it. The other chart that I showed in certain ways. So just take a moment to reflect on this chart and, see the Dasha sequence here. Saturn, Mercury, Ketu, Venus. What here do you see that is maybe something similar to what we just saw in the previous chart, and when activated could bring spiritual inclinations and teachers into a person's life?
Ketu aspected by Jupiter, and Jupiter aspecting the Lagna.
Okay, so what about what else is this? The common feature of this chart is that in the chart we just looked at, that woman also had Ketu in Pisces, right? And then aspected by Jupiter. Now, the houses that these planets are falling in, it was the 9th and the 5th for her. That's not the case here. But, see Jupiter's degrees, and the same thing that applies to the Jupiter that we looked at just previously apply in this chart. But then, look at the Ketu Mahadasha running from age 48 to 55, right? That 7-year period. What sub-period do you think could be a time when spirituality and a spiritual teacher came into his life in a big way?
Jupiter.
And why Jupiter?
Because Jupiter is in the 9th house from Ketu, or the Dasha Lagna.
That's it. That's it exactly, Girish. And, this is what I mean when I say that, these periods can show up in different ways. And we never want to neglect looking at a particular sub-period from a Dasha Lagna, right? And so, he was running his Ketu Mahadasha in Pisces, aspected by Jupiter, but then, using Ketu or Pisces as a Lagna, Jupiter now becomes the first lord in the 9th. And interestingly enough, it falls on the 7th from the birth logna, and all this kind of came into his life because of a relationship he got involved in with a woman who was a long-time, spiritual seeker. And, as a result of his relationship with her, this really started unfolding in a major way. But it wasn't just doing it for her, but very much became like an obsession for him during this time. He was listening to hours upon hours of tapes of this particular teacher, and reading the Gita and doing spiritual practices and having some inner spiritual experiences. And so, this was a major theme. This was back, starting, as you can see here, in Ketu Jupiter when he was 52, back in age 2012. Any other sort of notable or distinguishing features of this chart that you might want to highlight, favorable or unfavorable? Well, they actually don't have to do with the theme that I have today. So I think, we'll just leave this chart at this point. I wanted to, again, highlight how these things could happen, at different periods, and it can show up in different ways. Okay. One more chart this way, and we'll switch to another theme. I don't think I've shown you this chart yet. No, I did. Sorry.
Yeah, we have seen it.
We saw this one. Sorry. I think we've seen them all then, folks. So, another thing that the article was talking about was combinations that show up in a chart that are good for excelling, or first of all, being involved with Jyotish, but then also, excelling at Jyotish, right? So let me bring up a chart related to that. And I want to talk about that. Whoops. Okay. So look at this chart, folks. And first of all, just look at it from the standpoint of overall distinguishing features and anything that strikes you that way.
Hamsa Yoga.
Hamsa Yoga, right? Very prominent Hamsa Yoga there. Jupiter in its own sign in the Lagna. The Mahapurush gets very personalized, right? Because it's involving the Lagna and the Lagna Lord both. Right? So, and then, Chuck, what other yoga is given here that you're going to recognize?
I'm going to recognize, there's a Vesha yoga that's going on.
Well, related to Jupiter in specifically.
Oh, the Jupiter specifically.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a Sanafa yoga.
Right. So it's another one of these lunar yogas, and what I've been teaching is that I pay particularly attention to them when they're brought about by natural benefics that have some source of strength. Which what we see here is the moon in Aquarius, and then this strong Jupiter falls on the second from there, giving Sunapa yoga, right? And this can be good for, the moon is Chandra Lagna, so having a strong natural benefic like this in the second can be good for prosperity, for wealth, right? But I've noticed what it's also extremely good for is the person becomes a very good speaker, right? The second house, being the house of speech. Right? You'll see this in the chart of Deepak Chopra. You see this chart of Swami Vivekananda, where you've got Jupiter or, strong benefics falling in the second from there. What else is happening with this Jupiter yoga-wise that for this Lagna is very significant?
Dharma Karma Adhipati Yoga.
Okay, just explain that, Ganesh.
It's the 9th and the 10th Lord, which is Mars and Jupiter, aspecting each other in the 1st and the 7th house.
Right. So for anyone with Pisces Lagna, one of the best combinations that a person can have is the Jupiter-Mars combination. And then here when they're falling in angles, then that is a powerful Raja Yoga. It can be a powerful yoga for great fame, right? Considerable fame. So yes, that is absolutely a distinguishing feature of the chart. One thing, though, that the way in which you'd qualify that is to also see that from the moon, which is in Aquarius, and see if that combination repeats as a particularly good or significant combination. What kind of combination does it become from the moon? Anybody see anything about that? Good, bad, and different, not particularly, is it an angle trine combination again?
It's Dana Yoga from the moon. Jupiter Mars for Dana Yoga, because it would be the second and the second.
It's 10th.
So.
Yeah. Jupiter has certainly a prosperity and wealth giving quality because it rules both the 2nd and the 11th and falling in the 2nd here. But Mars, perspective, becomes the 3rd and the 10th Lord. Is there any other planet in here from when you think about Jyotish? You see the strong Jupiter, It's one of the things that was being highlighted in Jupiter in an angle. Remember those parameters that were those factors that K and Rao's Jyotish Kuru, Yogi Bhaskarnanda Ji was the kind of things that he liked to see. Jupiter in an angle being one of them, and Jupiter strong, since Jupiter rules Veda and Vedanga here. So that's present. Do you see any other factor here that is potentially significant that way as well for Jyotish?
Ketu in Jupiter sign.
You liked Ketu. You liked it more in the moksha houses, right? But Ketu here is in an angle, and it's disposited by Jupiter, right? Aspected by the ninth lord. So yeah, this Jupiter, this Ketu has some ways in which it gets spiritualized, and this person is a spiritually oriented individual. Really good knowledge of Shastra, as a matter of fact. Anything else? What's the other planet of astrology?
Mercury.
And any sort of thing about this Mercury that?
It's a
Vargotama.
It's a strong Mercury, right? So we've got Jupiter in its own sign and Mercury Vargotama. And now, Chuck, what helps this Mercury?
Now the Veschi Yoga helps this Mercury.
Right. So he was pointing out that obviously Mercury falls in the second from the Sun, right? And from Chandra Lagna, Mercury falls in the sixth from the birth Lagna, so not a particularly good placement that way. But from Chandra Lagna, what kind of combination does Mercury give?
It rules the 8th house.
Rules the 8th house. And
the 5th house.
It's the 5th lord and the 7th, right?
Mm-hmm.
From Chandra Lagna, it's the 5th lord and 7th. Does anybody recognize whose horoscope this is?
Is this Sanjay Roth's?
It is Sanjay Roth's horoscope.
Yeah.
It is Sanjay Roth's horoscope. And you've probably heard me said before, Sanjay and I don't approach Jyotish in the same way. But he is someone who has become quite renowned, quite famous in the world of Jyotish. And all of this happened initially in his Mercury Mahadasha, right? Mercury Mahadasha. But, one of the reasons I wanted to show you is that just like in the case of K and Rao and oftentimes others that you'll see, that, the two planets, two karakas most associated with Jyotish, and of course Veda and Vedanga, Jupiter and Mercury, are powerful in the chart. Right? And you'll see in Navamsha that these two planets fall in the angles, right, in a mutual glance with each other. And, Mercury goes to the 10th there, right? So again, it was in Mercury Mahadasha that he became famous as a Jyotishi. Any other thoughts or comments in regards to this chart before we move on?
Ketu is Vargotama as well.
Ketu is Vargotama now, quite strong. And then, think about, what happened after Mercury, which just ended 2015. He's now in his Ketu Mahadasha, Vargotama, and giving the results of Jupiter, primarily the Hamsa Yoga and also the Mahapurush Yoga. If anything, it could be that his stature in the world of Jyotish could increase during this time, or has increased during this time. I don't really know because I'm not really following it in any way. Okay. Any other comments before we move on? Now I'm going to bring up the chart of another, reasonably well-known astrologer and someone who was also a student of K and Rao's. Right? I just realized that before I do that, I want to go back to a chart I didn't bring up that I wanted to bring up, because there's some interesting things to understand and note about it. And this goes back, we're not doing with Jyotish, this goes back to the astrology, spirituality, and when gurus come into a person's life. So look at this chart. As I can find it here. Okay. Look at this chart here. And, again, just from the standpoint of the astrology of spirituality and timing of when a guru might come into his life, into a person's life. This is a chart of a woman, non-celebrity. What strikes you about it?
Hamsa Yoga again.
Hamsa Yoga, again, strong Jupiter, which, doesn't necessarily need to specifically relate to spirituality and spiritual life, but, Jupiter is...
Lagna Lord in ninth.
Lagna Lord in ninth. Just the Lagna Lord in ninth?
Along with the ninth Lord.
Involved. No, with the ninth Lord and forms the Shriant Yoga.
Very good, Vijay. Lagna Lord in ninth, with the ninth Lord, strong inclinations this way, and it's giving that the Vishnu variety of those three yogas, which is Shrinatha Yoga, brought about when the Lagna Lord Mercury. The Venus, Mercury, and the ninth Lord are all in angles or trions, and there's some source of strength, of course. Venus in its own sign here. So yes, this is a very distinguishing feature of the chart, and one in which it certainly could incline a person towards spirituality. What else?
Well, we also have the fifth Lord strong in its own sign. We have Jupiter, Gyanakaraka, strong in its own sign. And Mokshakarta Ketu is in Jupiter's sign, in the fourth.
Right. All that is true. So we have a very strong ninth house, right? And we have a very strong fifth house, house of Poorva Punya, right? And does anybody, such like Ekaterina and so forth, notice any other yoga that say, these planets that Chuck just mentioned are involved in that relate to spirituality?
Oh, sure. And I don't know if I remember the name. We may have to go to Ekaterina for that, but it's Saturn, Jupiter in angle and trines. And Saturn, of course, is the Lord of the fifth in an angle house, its own house.
Virinchi Yoga. Yeah.
There we go, yes.
Virinchi Yoga here as well. That Saturn and Jupiter give, and they give it strongly here. So yes, you see a number of factors here, and then see the Dasha sequence and see that she's currently in Saturn, right? So what's this going to bring out?
Poorva Punya, mantra, spiritual practices.
And it has, and in a big way. Right? And in a very big way. See the degrees of Saturn, right? Well, actually, I don't want to go in that direction now, but, a guru did come into her life in the Saturn major period. It's the guru that wrote the story that I included in my article, The True Guru, and that there was this man, Baba Haridas, the man, this yogi who has maintained mauna or silence since the 1950s that I was writing about. And does anybody want to hazard a guess as to which sub-period that happened in?
Either Saturn Ketu or Saturn Venus.
Well, Saturn Mercury.
No, Saturn Mercury.
Could be Mercury as well, yeah.
And why does Mercury become particularly eligible here?
Lagna Lord in the ninth.
From Saturn.
Well, it's the Lagna Lord. It's in the ninth house, so that makes it eligible, right? But I think I heard
the Saturn too.
Yeah, I think I heard Vijay just say that from Dasha Lagna, using Capricorn as the Lagna now, Mercury becomes the ninth Lord. And then look at what happens to the fifth house from there. So see what period she's in now, period and sub-period. You see it?
Saturn Venus.
Saturn, Venus. So, anybody have any hazard, any guess about? And by the way, I posted this chart for those of you who saw it in the Jyotish Journey closed Facebook group. I posted this chart of this gentleman who was the retired astrophysics professor. Everybody, and so those people who saw that, right? And I asked you about what was happening in his Rahu moon period, and then commented on that later on, if people recall that. This is his partner. They're not married, but they're, in a marriage-like situation. And, she's running her Saturn-Venus. What might be going on there in Saturn-Venus that is related to that other posting? Anybody have any idea? So what's one of the spiritual meanings of the fifth house, besides Poorva Punya?
Mantras.
Mantra.
Right. And so, like him, and as I explained, she is also on a daily basis involved in, extensive use of chanting of mantras and of stotrams and learning these things extensively. But then think about this, Venus as the ninth lord in the ninth, Venus with the ninth lord from the Dasha Lagna. And again, then, it's in the fifth house as the fifth lord from the Dasha Lagna. What's one of the other meanings of the ninth house related to spirituality besides guru?
Teaching. Teaching.
There's been a little component of that, right?
And with Venus as the second lord, that would kind of lean in that direction a little bit, I think.
Well, I can understand that interpretation. Folks, she's actually experiencing a very a unique destiny in a way. She's like the person that she's with, this person whose data I posted in the closed Facebook group. She's absolutely immersed in doing Vedic rituals, arati, puja, and very elaborate yagyas. And she's been training with her partner to do these up at this place called Mount Madana, where this man Baba Haridas had trained many of his close disciples into doing these rituals. I recently observed one because I was on a retreat up there. But what's unique is that normally in the Indian spiritual tradition, women don't play this role. Right? They don't become priests. They don't get trained in this way. But you have this kind of interesting situation. This is a white Caucasian woman, and she's actually been performing pujas up there. And there's a lot of Indian families that come from San Jose to attend, and sometimes they're rather surprised to see this woman, this white woman, performing these rituals at the temple, both the Hanuman temple there and the Ganesha temple here. So she's experiencing a rather unique destiny that way. That's very clearly reflected by the periods and sub-periods that she's running. And just from a mundane standpoint, these combinations in 5 and 9, what kind of yogas did you get?
Saturn and Moon together in the fifth is a Dawn yoga.
Right. What about these combinations up in Taurus?
Yeah, that's the Ravi Yoga 9th and 10th.
Yeah, very good one.
Dharma Karmadipati Yoga.
Sorry, say again, Ganesh?
It's Dharma Karmadipati Yoga, 9th and 10th Lord to the
Right. So, forming significant Danyan Raja Yogas, right? And she's able to do all this because she's independently wealthy. She, is very well off financially. She doesn't have to work, and so she can just, dedicate and commit her life to these sorts of things. A rather unique chart that way, and rather an unusual, unique destiny. Any other comments then before we move on?
Yeah, the 9th house is also the 12th Lord in it. And in the Navamsa, the Lagna Lord is in the 9th house. and Venus is the 5th house in the second, in Saturn sign.
And so you're saying?
That's why, like, the Saturn Venus was exactly the way that you mentioned.
Right. Okay. And since you highlighted, yes, the combination in the 9th house contains the 12th Lord Sun, right?
Yeah.
And what started in Saturn Mercury, and then that continued in Saturn Ketu, and then Saturn Mercury, Saturn Venus, is that quite regularly she and her partner go to this retreat center, this Mount Madonna retreat center, to go on retreat themselves, but then also to continue to train in doing these Vedic rituals and performing them there. So you see the additional influence of the 12th Lord here as well. And again, they're spending time in the ashram of their guru, where the Lord of the 4th from the 9th. Okay, so before I run out of time here, I want to bring up, now we're back to the theme of astrologers. Some of you may recognize a gentleman's name by Von Paul Manley. Right? And Von Paul is actually at one point, he was a student of mine. He refers to me as his mentor. But, K. and Rao has been, sort of his primary teacher, student of K. and Rao's. And, for involvement in the Vedic tradition of knowledge, a Vedanga like Jyotish, what combinations in his chart strike you? And, their activation in the Dasha sequence here, if anything. I think I've stumped the panel.
Well, I see that the Lord in the 9th is together with Ketu, Mercury and Ketu together, and the Sun, of course, is the Karaka of the soul.
Well, it's a relevant comment because, again, it's under what conditions does Ketu get spiritualized, and one of those is when it's connected to the 5th of the 9th Lord, which it is here, and we're talking about the Sun being the natural Amakaraka. It's with Ketu here. The combination with Ketu from a mundane standpoint is not a particular good thing, but from this standpoint, it's not a bad thing at all. And am I saying this correctly? Is the Sun the Atmakaraka here? Is it the planet with the highest degrees?
Looks like it to me.
Yeah, and so again, now that combination of this is what I was talking about, the soul quality of saints, that the Atmakaraka conjunct Ketu can be good from that standpoint, right? But again, getting this back to the idea of this, this person has been very immersed in the Vedic tradition of knowledge, not just Jyotish, but certainly Jyotish, for quite some time. And what combination in his chart could suggest that?
Yeah, you can see Jupiter and Saturn and Venus. I can see that spiritual thing from the Virinchi Yoga, again, reflective.
Very good. Very good, Vijay. His Virinchi Yoga is present in this chart as well, and given the fact that, and what makes it again, I've talked about for this yoga to give those kind of results, the planets involved have to have some source of strength, and also there's got to be other spiritual indications in the chart. First of all, define the Virinchi Yoga for everybody. Some may not be familiar with it, and then where do you see sources of strength there?
Sure, definitely. So Virinchi Yoga is formed when Jupiter, Saturn, and the 5th Lord occur in trines and quadrants, angles, basically. So, and especially in this one, Jupiter and Saturn are in the Lagna, and Saturn additionally is Vargotama, which makes it really strong here. And Venus, which is the 5th Lord, is also Vargotama.
Very good. So you've got Venus, the Yogakaraka planet for this Lagna, right? And it's the 10th Lord and the 5th Lord, strongly placed in an angle. Two sources of strength. What are its two sources of strength?
Jupiter have directional strength also.
Yes.
Well, we'll stay with Venus for a moment, folks. We'll get to that. But, Venus, two sources of strength. I think Vijay mentioned Vargotam. What else?
Directional strength.
Directional strength for Venus as well.
Well, also directional strength in the 4th house, right?
Mm-hmm.
Strongly placed, he's not been running Venus Mahadasha and won't really want it in his lifeline. It's too bad for him, actually. But, and then the other components of the Vrinci Yoga, Saturn, Vijay mentioned, not just Svakshetra, but also Vargotama, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, Jupiter's peculiar condition here, what would you say about it? And, Katrina mentioned directional strength, right?
Well, it's
Debilitated.
Go ahead, Vijay.
No. So, see, since Jupiter is debilitated, it's kind of, and also with Saturn, so there is some cancellation there.
I would say it's Nitra Bhadra Raja Yoga.
Yeah.
Yes, and you'd be correct, Chuck. Right? It's it's actually the same combination you see in the chart of President Barack Obama with Capricorn Lagna, Saturn there, Sasha Yoga, and Vargotama with Jupiter. And, Jupiter has a strong factor for cancellation because with its Vargotama sign lord, but then also because it's falling at an angle gives Nichabanga Raja Yoga. But really it's that Varinci Yoga that one really needs to see here to understand this person's, strong involvement in the spiritual tradition of India, the Vedic tradition, but then also strong involvement with Jyotish as a Vedanga. Now, what makes this Varinci Yoga particularly strong, besides the things we've already mentioned? Is anything else to see? Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's the Voshi, right? So it's false 12th from the sun, which adds luster.
Yes, the yoga's combinations that Jupiter and Saturn are giving do get enhanced, as we've been talking about, because they're falling 12th from the sun. Very good. Involved in the Voshi Yoga. And then
it repeats from the moon also.
Beautiful, Ekaterina, beautiful. From Chandralagna in Virgo, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction becomes Varinci Yoga, because now Saturn is the 5th Lord, and they're combining everything said about that. And one other thing I would highlight about Jupiter. Well, I just want to check before you comment. One of the things I wanted to highlight is that Jupiter goes into Aquarius in Navamsha, and you've heard me remark about that probably too often. Go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say that, and it looks like we've got Saraswati Yoga going on here too, that Jupiter partakes in.
Absolutely. So, think of the yogas that Jupiter's coming out with here. It's Nichabanga Raja Yoga. It gives the results of the Sasha Yoga as an impressionable 12th Lord. It's Varinci Yoga. And from both angles, yogas are always stronger when they repeat from Chandralagna. And it's got the Voshi Yoga. And, so everything that it's saying about it here. And, he became, somewhat significant in the world of Jyotish in the Jupiter Mahadasha, now followed by the Saturn Mahadasha, which is now currently in, right? And so, this is a chart to consider from the standpoint of Jyotish. I don't know exactly the timing of when he got into Jyotish. Certainly gurus came into his life this way during the Jupiter Mahadasha, just Jupiter being Jupiter. Okay, before we run out of time here, I want to show you the chart of a person who was, again, a very long time student of K. and Rao's, a Japanese person who went through the programs there in Delhi, was a part of K. and Rao's research groups, for a long time. Now teaching has established something of a school in Japan. Where is your chart? Oh, goodness. Here it is. What do you notice about this chart that's in some way anywhere similar to the chart I just showed you?
Very similar. This is as we talked.
Sorry?
Virinchi again repeats here, along with Mala Amsa Yoga.
Right.
So you have the Virinchi Yoga again, right? Brought about by the Saturn-Jupiter conjunction here. Jupiter obviously, has a good source of strength there, being in its own sign. And then doesn't repeat from the moon, as the one did previously. But then, see the Dasha sequence. This man entered his Jupiter Mahadasha at age 16, right? So 16 years of Jupiter. And now he's, then ran the 19 years of Saturn. So that's 36 years of the Dasha sequence giving Virinchi Yoga, right? And, like Von Paul, I just showed you, he's been very immersed in the Indian Vedic tradition of knowledge and just very immersed in this Vedanga. I'll tell you a quick funny story about when I first met Sakai, but I didn't really, know who he was. I went to spend time with K.N. Rao in the fall of 1996 because he had stopped coming to the U.S. And, what I quickly discovered is that to get any time alone with him, the only time that would happen, if you stayed up late in the night with him, he was very much a night owl. And, so one night there was this Japanese guy there that I later came to know that who this man was. And we're both pretty young at the time, and much younger than we were now. This was back in 1996. And it was like a contest as to see who could stay awake longer and stay up long enough in order to spend individual time with K and Rao. I'm happy to say that I won, but it was kind of a funny incident because we were both kind of trying to outlast the other individual. It was funny. Anyway, so this is an interesting chart to consider from the standpoint. If you miss the fact, what kind of yoga is Saturn and Jupiter for this chart to begin with? What kind of more obvious yoga?
Raja Yoga, 4-5 Raja Yoga.
It's 4-5, right? But then, remember what periods I was highlighting as periods that a person often starts learning Jyotish or gets very immersed in learning Jyotish besides, Karaka periods. Does anybody remember from the article?
They fall in the fourth house.
Right, they fall in the fourth house, and just in keeping with that idea, I want to bring up the chart. I was recently contacted by a woman who wanted to be a part of the mentorship program. In other words, she wanted to have me mentor and be her Jyotish guru. I want to show you this chart here, and note that she's running, what's she running now? Note that in 2011, she moved into her Venus major period. And, this was a woman, that was involved in Western astrology for a long time, but then she discovered the Vedic system and has been trying to learn it on her own since then, and then decided that she would make better progress if she had a teacher. So she's approached me this way. But I want people to see that it's happening in the Venus Mahadasha, placed in the fourth house. And I've actually seen this, over and over again, quite frequently, that people are getting involved and deeply immersed in Jyotish and planets associated with their fourth house, fourth lord, that kind of thing. Okay, so, we've come to the end of our time here. Do people have any questions about, what they saw in the article or anything that we saw today or talked about today? what's gratifying for me to see is the way in which people are really starting to learn the yogas and really starting to recognize the yogas in the chart and to qualify them. You've heard me say over and over again that the essence of Jyotish is yogas and dashas. Yoga show what, dasha show when. And, you'll just see this over. And so to the degree in which you can recognize all the yogas that a planet is involved in or not, and to be able to qualify those yogas is the great degree in which you can get proficient at Jyotish. All right. So unless there are any additional comments or questions, we can close with our usual Sanskrit prayer. Om Asatoma Sadgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Sarvesham Swasti Bhavatu Sarvesham Shanti Bhavatu Sarvesham Purnam Bhavatu Sarvesham Mangalam Bhavatu Loka Samasta Sukhiyo Bhavantu Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.